Compare for us the 60s radicals that you encountered and probably studied alongside of and examined with today's radicals.
Well, and I've met many of them too. I've met Bill Ayers and talked to Bill Ayers. The 60s radicals were more focused on the Vietnam War. That was their main focus. They wanted to oppose the Vietnam War. Of course, Martin Luther King had raised the consciousness of the country on civil rights, and he did it on a very different basis. He wanted equality of rights. He wanted color blindness, as it were, where color would not be a determining characteristic. And he made a big impact on the country. I saw Martin Luther King. I agreed with Martin Luther King. But when Jack Kennedy was assassinated, the politics of the United States became harder and more radicalized. By 1965, the race riots started, and we were going into Vietnam in a big way. Lyndon Johnson started that actually before Kennedy was buried. He started reversing the decisions and going into Vietnam. It's almost the first policy decisions he did. And that radicalized the country. The race riots first in Los Angeles and Watts, and then in Huff, Cleveland, where I was, so I got to see them up close. Began studying that would have been 1965, 66. I would have been a freshman and sophomore in college. I began working on them and writing things, and my professors wanted to publish my papers. I was actually, as an undergraduate, writing things that got into print. And I finally wrote, I think, 3 books as an undergraduate with my own name on them, and several articles in law journals and other places. I got to do a lot of advanced work in the 60s on the race riots and on the anti-war protests. These riots today are more of a true result of the universities having adopted this Marxism, which they have done, and changing it into this social justice political theory and identity politics. So this is much more ideologically based. And the race crisis, which the Black Lives Matter is articulating, is really not the magnitude of problem that racial discrimination was in the 1960s. I remember segregation as a child, and I remember seeing separate colored, which they called them at the time, restaurants or eating facilities and washrooms and the like. And there was true poverty and true economic discrimination in those years. It's largely, the laws have at least mitigated against that since 1965, especially the Voting Rights Act and several other pieces of legislation. So today, I think Lyndon Johnson's programs created a black dependency, broke up black families. I think Daniel Patrick Moynihan was right when he warned Lyndon Johnson the aid for families with dependent children would cause families to break up in the black communities. And I see this being much more of a race, the idea that we should take a knee to the black race is just another reversed form of racial discrimination. So Black Lives Matter is all about race and identity.
All about that, with the ultimate goal, though, of implementing a progressive socialist communist system.
They want a revolution. See, the 60s failed to create the kind of revolution that Ayers thought would result.
Let me ask you, though, is it fair to say, you mentioned the Vietnam War was their primary objection, but were they using the Vietnam War to discredit the system and America in the same way today they're using systemic racism as the basis to discredit America, with the ultimate goal of overthrowing the system?
Yes, I mean, there was clearly, that was where they were headed. But there were 2 things that have happened since then. One is you've had a lot more of the writing of Marxist analysis of history. So the textbooks have been written with a Marxist perspective. You've had much more analysis of the Civil War, of slavery, of the United States from a race perspective. This is the kind of critical theory that led to social justice theory. And John Rawls was at Harvard when I was there, and I spent some time studying John Rawls. and he was all about justice as fairness. That's where a lot of this started from intellectually. But the point is, today you're dealing with you don't have the same focus. I mean, when you go to say, okay, the cases like this, George Floyd and these other cases, there's only 10 or 15 of these incidents a year where white cops encounter an unarmed black male who dies in the interaction. So it's not like it was in Vietnam, where you had universal draft and people were leaving and fighting and we were suffering 50,000 deaths. It was a very fundamentally different kind of crisis.
So theoretically, there was more support for the movement, at least in that sense, as far as opposition to the Vietnam War, versus today. Well, I don't know. I mean, certainly when you see all these corporations jumping on the anti-racism, Black Lives Matter bandwagon, you see the sports leagues jumping on the bandwagon, they certainly have support in that sense. Whether they have, in
a sense, so the Black Lives Matter has learned how to use a lot of these techniques, and they're more advanced on the manipulation of the media. The media is much more leftist than it was in the 60s. And so ideologically, you've got an echo chamber in the media, which will not examine stories that are critical to the left. And you've got, with the corporations, a form of the protection racket being run. It's extortion. In other words, we won't ruin your brand provided you take a knee to Black Lives Matter and pay us money. So we won't trash all your restaurants. We won't trash your brand. And corporations just use this. They say, well, let's pay them. Did you see the Lululemon example today? No, I haven't seen that one.
Lululemon, the activewear company, $45 billion company that's, selling workout pants for $100. They're now promoting the end of capitalism. And so on their website, they're teaching courses about and decolonizing. I swear to God, this is a term. We got to figure this one out. Decolonizing gender. Well, whatever that. Do you know what that means?
Oh yeah, I don't. That's look. And the social justice critical theory. The whole thing stems from the idea that colonization, slavery, in other words, it's based on various French philosophers actually who say that all of these things like gender is a social construct. It only exists in words. And so therefore, with identity politics, you're allowed to have your own identity, whether that is not, it's not sex because male and female, but it's gender, which means your orientation. And then it can be past lives, it can be animals, it can be all kinds of weird things. And that's your identity. And they're saying that the traditional male, female, heterosexual definitions are politicalizations that result from colonization. So they're the oppressive terminology that we've been taught to accept as morals, whereas they're amorphous and largely incomprehensible definitions. They get into things like intersectionality. So, you can be a black woman, now you've got two complexes. Asian, now you got three. Okay, and so
we've got
those things interact. Yes,
I don't know if you heard about this new law in California. They had already passed a couple of years ago that if you're a corporation formed in California, you need to have at least one woman on the board.
Oh, sure. And diversity. The Oscars are going to have diversity requirements. These things are. I look at this, first of all. It did not succeed with the revolution in the 1960s, and it won't succeed here today. Because when you look at the reality of what Antifa is and Black Lives Matter, defund the police, and you see the chaotic violence that they're bringing into these democratic cities, nobody is going to accept this who is mature and wants to understand civil society as a place in which you can live without these people coming and trashing your home and screaming in your face. These groups begin to attract psychopaths, violent psychopaths, and they have a cycle where they will reach intensity. And I don't think we're at the most intense yet, but they produce a reaction. People say, I'm done with this. We're going to move out of the city. We're going to move out of New York. We're going to reject all this because the architecting that these leftist groups want are a society in which nobody wants to live. You know, you're not going to have any First Amendment. You're not going to have any Second Amendment. You're going to be forced to agree with their ideological agenda. They're going to set up a totalitarian state that'll tell you what you're permitted to think and will track and follow you everywhere you go. People forget that the fascism was an ideology of the left. Both of the control ideologies coming out of Nazi Germany, communism, and also Nazism, the Nazis were national socialists. They just had difference. The communists believed that there should be no private property at all. The Nazis were happy with private property. They just wanted multinational corporations to be controlled by the government. In a sense, we are more Nazi than we are communist. And the attempt to make the United States communist has been a failing attempt because, again, while we've become more authoritarian and we've gotten far more government control than I'm comfortable with, even today, people do not want to live in what is essentially a Maoist cultural revolution. And if you study the Cultural Revolution, you know, it was complete chaos. They destroyed a whole group of the intelligentsia. They destroyed culture and history in China, and it was very, very destructive. These movements on the left end up killing millions of people. And I'm hoping that this will open people's eyes enough, have a great awakening where we can reject these ideologies once and forever as malware, the type of thinking you get in your brain. And just like malware in a computer stops the computer working, these political ideologies are malware politically in the brain.
Yeah, well, they've kind of achieved, I don't know what percent you would put on it, but certainly as far as changing history and culture and so on, they at least seem to be 10 to 15% of the way there as just a random guess. But, you know, how do you see this playing out? Ultimately, you're optimistic, and so am I, because we know it's a failed ideology. And at the end of the day, just like Muslim extremism and so on, you know, failed ideologies eventually are going to wither away. But how do you see this happening?
Well, my best expectation is, and I wrote an ebook on the plan to remove Donald Trump from the presidency, and I warned him about this continuing coup. He read it. I said this violence was only going to intensify through the summer and into the fall. If Donald Trump wins, and I expect he will win, you'll see intensifying violence and probably a continuation of the coup efforts. They won't stop. But the American public is going to get tired of it. And the idea of defunding the police isn't going to happen. Eventually, like in all these socialist ideologies, they run out of money. So right now, the governments and the governors in New York and New Jersey are largely bankrupt. You'll start to see a deterioration of the city services or the state services, people being fired, and the bankruptcies will affect the ability of these governments to keep going, affecting ultimately fire and police and other functions of the state. So
do you actually see finally some of these Democratic mayors and governors being ousted in
yes.
California and New York and actually being replaced by Republicans?
Well, California, I think, is, the whole West Coast has gotten into this ideology. You're having a migration out of California, people who can't take it anymore. And California will continue down to the extreme where nobody can take it anymore. I mean, you've got forest fires. Now they blame that on global warming. Actually, I think the sun is less vibrant today, less dominant. It has fewer sunspots, so it's in a minimum period, which means the Earth will begin to cool off. It won't be noticeable on time series analysis for decades, but it's happening. And so, the carbon dioxide is not a noxious chemical. We exhale it, plants breathe it. But California won't let anybody tear down a tree. You've got to hug a tree. You can't go in and do normal forest management. Forest fires are part of the cycle of normal forest management. And it's not handled, it's handled ideologically.
Yeah. By the way, I got to tell you, I just got back from Yosemite. So I don't get in the California forest very often, but I was in there and I got to see it with my own two eyes. It is all kindling.
Yeah, it's tinder.
It's all tinder, just ready to blow.
And it's not been managed with a view to understanding that forest fires are natural. just from lightning. And, the forests burn and they replenish the soil with the nutrients, and another forest comes back.
Right. We implemented a strategy of immediately putting out any forest fire, and that was the wrong strategy. And I think we've known that it was wrong now. There's been people talking about it for 20 years now, but they haven't turned it around. And instead, they seem to like having the forest fires because they can blame it on global warming.
Yeah. The future of all these socialist states like California is that they end up in bankruptcy and chaos. So you're going to have unmanageable traffic. You're going to have a flood of illegal immigrants. You're going to be releasing people from prison. You're going to have increasing taxations to pay for the cost of all this, and ideologies that don't make any sense when you try to live by them or implement them. And eventually the people who agree with it live there. Everybody else leaves, let them be bankrupt. And eventually it becomes so dysfunctional that no one can function in it, no one can survive. So it's going to collapse of its own weight in California and others if given enough time. It's just that in the process, a lot of people from California will move out and they'll take their leftist ideology with them.
So comparing it again to the 60s, have they made more progress today than they did in the 60s?
Only because they've done more education in the schools. I think I've always said in this one that they moved too soon. Donald Trump forced them into the open. Now we see exactly who they are as Marxists.
And we've heard their chants of death to America.
They should have waited until my generation died, the generation that was raised by World War II and understands American values, understands American exceptionalism, understands the political theory that led to the Constitution, which is based on the idea that governments inherently tend to gain power and become corrupt. And you've got to do all kinds of checks and balances to have any chance that a government will stay in any length of time by its original founding principles. And we struggle with that all the time.
What do you think their strategy is as far as exactly how it would play out? I mean, we know they want Biden to win, but that's just a very small piece to it. What do you think their ultimate objective is? Is it a genuine revolution where America just doesn't exist anymore, or it's a series of small victories like Medicare for all?
Well, they'll pass social legislation, Medicare for all, greater taxes, all the things, Green New Deal. They want to do all of those things, but they also want us to be part of a new world order, internationalism, globalism. They want the United States to go away as a country. They don't believe in our founding principles or our system of government. They want it to be much more of a totalitarian government without a First Amendment. They want to have all these rights to free this, free that. Well, the history of these socialist movements is that the followers and the people who implement them will believe they're going to get all those goodies. And the people in the street today with Antifa and Black Lives Matter, when the Nancy Pelosi's take over, who always understood this was a way to get rich and for a small group that would be the elite. The basic premise of communism is give me your wallet. I can spend your money better than you can. A, I'm going to keep a lot of it for myself, and B, I'm going to give it to somebody else. Well, no rational person would want to do that if it was sold honestly. So in other words, they generate social justice consciousness, make you guilty, make you feel you're not doing enough. You should help everybody. You pay back for your privileges, all these things which don't work. Then you're paying someone else not to work. And that the only way people can, it's like your immune system. The only way you can get a good immune system is to go out in the world and let it be exposed to illness. Well, the only way you're going to build wealth is to get out there and work, do something, build value. And yes, we did build it. Barack Obama is wrong. Nobody built it for us. Those who create business did build it. And if we don't have that principle, the socialist control will ultimately undermine the international status of U.S. businesses. They want to weaken the United States. They want to lower everybody's standard of living to the lowest common denominator. And the elite who run communism will be happy to steal everybody's money and let them go to this lower common denominator. Communist societies end up where you don't have any bread on the table, you don't have any work. It ends up in a state that is very, very impossible to live in, Venezuela. And we've all become Venezuelans. Well, that could happen here, but I think there's enough Americans who are yet understanding the constitutional values that this will fail because it went too soon. They freaked out over Donald Trump, and if they spent another 10 years indoctrinating in the schools, they would have had a much better chance of pulling this off.
Well, there's a bunch of other things I wanted to get to. We've got limited time. So let me just touch on one more biggie, which is COVID and our government's handling of COVID, and as it relates to what we were just talking about, because clearly there's got to be a correlation here between what we're seeing with BLM in the streets and the fact that people are all locked in their homes with no jobs and nothing to do. So, I mean, and maybe that's the answer ultimately to them moving too soon, is maybe it's COVID that pushed this into them moving too soon.
In part, it's Donald Trump freak out. I mean, they've been after Donald Trump since he came down the escalator in 2015 and announced he was going to run for president. He scared them into the streets too soon. COVID, again, you see the medical elite leftists, globalists, Fauci in the crowd, who are in the CDC and the NIH, are both not government agencies per se. They're public-private partnerships, and they are foundations. Get a lot of money from Gates. They get a lot of money from Big Pharmacy. Fauci and the other doctors get patents on treatments for various diseases. Those patents get paid when a pharmaceutical is made. And so Fauci ran into Donald Trump's office and he said, 2 million people are going to die. Here's my model. It shows you that unless you lock everything down. Well, Donald Trump is not an epidemiologist. And the government scientists come in and tell you this as president, and you don't listen to them, you've got a political liability. The lockdowns, I think, were the worst thing we could do. Traditionally, you might quarantine those who are sick, but you let everybody else get into society where their immune systems are going to get more robust. And this hydroxychloroquine and zinc and the azithromycin is a protocol Dr. Zelenko developed. I've worked with him a lot on this, and it is very efficacious in the early stages of the disease. I'm convinced of that from the clinical studies that have been done. And every one of the studies I've seen trying to demonize hydroxychloroquine has been fraudulent and withdrawn largely from the journals. So we had
Governor Cuomo essentially banned it in New York. So you had a governor deciding what doctors could give to patients.
And the states are in control of a lot of these kinds of decisions. The president does not, under federalism, have the authority to come in and tell the states necessarily what to do. And Donald Trump's strategy, which was really one I think he was smart to take it, was let these Democratic governors fail. And now that they won't reopen their states, they're begging for a bailout. And Donald Trump has said, no more money. So states like New York, cities like New York, states like New York and New Jersey are going to be in economic distress now.
But it's not just the Democrat states. I mean, ultimately, everyone caved. I mean, even DeSantis in Florida, who was the last holdout, he ended up caving. And not to mention that, but almost every other country did the same thing. So how do you explain that?
Well, it's been first time we've been prepared for this. Gates has been running seminars and tests on these kinds of pandemics. We've had movies and saying, here comes, go back to 1918 with the flu epidemic. Today, it was all architected so that people would think, well, I might get this and I might die. I said from the very beginning, analyzing the disease, that it was a serious disease if it took hold in you, but at early stages, and for most people, it was going to be no worse than the flu. And that's turning out to be the case. We even see the numbers and the statistics having to be revised dramatically downward, and emphasizing comorbidity as really where the disease is most dangerous. Of course, if people have multiple health problems, they're going to be more vulnerable to almost anything happening. And they're more at risk as they get older, as they get heavier, as they get diabetes, etc.
Isn't your reaction that we panicked and overreacted? And
I mean, we did.
But okay, but the question is, why did we panic and overreact? And my theory would be that, in fact, we weren't prepared. there hadn't been enough discussion and knowledge about this. If you look at all the Democratic debates that had been going on, did pandemics ever come up in any of those debates before COVID? No, it wasn't on the table as an issue. And I blame a lot of people, but there's blame to go around for that, maybe Bill Gates was correct to be trying to alert people to pandemics, but had we been more knowledgeable about them, perhaps we would not have overreacted and panicked.
Well, actually, I've been reading about epidemics since about 8 years old. I mean, my father had books on pandemics. And there's been a history of pandemics going back to the Peloponnesian War, which was something several hundred years before Christ in Greece. There was a major epidemic in Athens, which killed a lot of people. My first criteria on this disease was, the Black Death, for instance. A disease is really serious if you can get it and you die that day. Okay, that's my first criteria. And when I realized with COVID, people weren't dying the first day. And then I analyzed the nature of the disease, and its genome was being published. I saw how it operated. It was going to be serious if it took hold in you. But early stages, I was working on various medical treatments of it going back to January and aware that this was there. I mean, yes, we were stampeded into a lockdown, and it largely was because the American people aren't educated or haven't studied, and the doctors who were politically oriented to want control use the disease to architect social control.
Well, and doctors also naturally give conservative advice. If we always listened to our doctors, we wouldn't eat red meat, right? So you can't just listen to the doctors.
The doctors are often wrong about everything they say, and that was the case here too, because medical science is still very much yet an art, and we are become so dependent on these pharmaceuticals as if you take a pill for everything. And the pharmaceutical industry has done a lot to eliminate the natural paths, so that we are not in any particularly good structure with medicine in terms of long term. It's all oriented towards money at this point in the big pharmacy. Donald Trump's trying, and I think will succeed if he gets another term, in reversing a lot of that. But there are many cures like hydroxychloroquine and zinc, various vitamin treatments, lots of different naturopathic treatments that do succeed. The point is, the fundamental issue, we're not born in little biohazard suits. So God did not make the design of this place that you had to be isolated and protected. It was made so that you had to go out and get your immune system to be robust. And in fact, at the end, even if you succeed tremendously, you still die. There's no way to live in this place permanently. It's a temporary existence. And if you are intelligent about how you live, you can possibly prolong it. But even that has a lot to do with genetics and how you're structured. So, the idea that this experience here on Earth is going to be fair, or it is going to be easy or fun or lasting. I mean, when I studied Thomas Hobbes in graduate school, Thomas Hobbes used to say life is nasty, cruel, brutish, and short. I always used to wonder about Thomas Hobbes, whether it had been okay with him if it was just nasty, cruel, and brutish. But short was the real insult. You go through all this and it's short.
Right.
That I thought was what pushed him over the top.
Yeah. Well, you were an educated person on pandemics, and that's why you've got a rational response, and not enough people were. My last question about COVID and my concern about it is the long-term ramifications of people being willing to relinquish so much control to government. I'm wondering about the precedent that's setting for the future, and the precedent of how many people received a government check that never before would have ever received a government check, and now have accepted a government check in the precedent for that going forward.
There's a lot of re-architecting going on to condition people to go into a more authoritarian society. There's no doubt about it. I think the fear factor was one that prompted it. I've written another ebook on my website, CorsiNation.com, on COVID-20, and I've architected what the intelligence agents say could easily be a next disease. It will be more deadly. And if a more deadly COVID, which does come closer to killing you in the same day you get it, people will stampede right back into quarantine because that's how we've been conditioned. And again, human condition in the Black Death that swept through, Europe, for much of the world in 1300s, 1400s, you did half the population died. And if you face that kind of a calamity, that's going to cause major social disruption, obviously. But the point is, half the population didn't die. And what the nature of human beings are that the ones who survive are carrying on both the techniques and the immune systems and the physical adaptations we need in order to continue to survive. I don't believe in evolution according to Darwin. I look back at the extinctions, of which we've had 5 or 6 major extinctions where almost everything on the planet died, and it comes back almost instantly. It doesn't go through starting with a single cell and all of this nonsense. So I think that the whole process of species advancement is much more complex. And again, like I put in terms of relativity theory or fractals, we're only at the very edge of being unable to understand these things. We don't even understand relativity theory, even though we live in a relativistic world. Another 100 years from now, it's going to be different. We'll look back on today as an era was fairly primitive in our understanding. Even though we've got computers and technology and all the rest of it, I look at every road in the United States as obsolete because they're all architected where you have to drive. They're not smart highways. There's fundamental re-engineering going to happen in the next 100 years, and human beings are going to struggle to keep up with it and not be put into totalitarian situations or controlled. Preserving freedom is, I think, one of the underlying challenges of the human condition. And I don't think it'll ever get easier.
Thank you to Dr. Corsi. Please go check out his website and his books on Amazon. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker, and to our intern, Jake Wall. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.